everyone, my name is Jocelyn, and today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about bullet journaling and paper quality. I started my first bullet journal about 10 months ago when I bought my first Leuchtturm. I was drawn to that particular product because the name kept coming up in Google searches. And while I've really enjoyed it and have gotten a lot of great use out of it, I've noticed that not all pens and markers are great for using with the Leuchtturm. So that got me thinking, what are the different types of bullet journals out there? What's the difference in paper quality? And how will different pens and markers respond to those different qualities of paper? Today, we're going to test a variety of different pens and markers on those various journals to see how they respond. And then we'll take a visit to my local art supply store to speak with my friend Brian to see what he has to say about paper quality and ink and how they work together. Let's get started. I have 6 bullet journals with me today, technically only 5. The Moleskine that I bought is a lined journal, but the effect will be the same because the paper is the same. So, it's gonna feel like Christmas. Time to open them up. It's harder than I thought it would be. Hang on. The first set of pens I'm going to test are fine point pens. Let's get started. Okay, I've finished writing in each of these journals with each of the fine point markers that I brought today. I have to say that at first glance, they all look pretty similar. There's no feathering. Feathering is when you look at the page and you see the ink start to feather out from where you have written. They all look basically exactly the same. I will say the Rhodia yeehaw, Rhodia. The Rhodia looks a little bit sharper, a little bit cleaner than some of the others, but actually the Lemome looks quite clean as well. Now it's time for the real test. I'm going to flip the pages over and take a look at ghosting. Ghosting is when you can see kind of a shadow of the ink through to the opposite side. I'm going to look for bleeding. Bleeding is when the ink actually bleeds through the paper. So let's find out. Alright, so there is a very marginal amount of ghosting with each of them. You can tell that there is something written on the opposite side of the page. I would say the best ones for ghosting, probably the Lemome. Surprise, this is a new one to me that I had never tried before. This one, the Dingbats one, looks pretty good as well. Little bit of ghosting with the Leuchtturm, a little bit more, little bit with the Rhodia. To the Bondibook and with the Moleskine, there's actual bleed through. That's something that you definitely don't want. In fact, with both of these, it bled through not only to the opposite side of the page, but to a little bit of the page that came after that. So far, Bondibook and Moleskine are not quite measuring up on the pen test to the other 4. Let's try some other pens. The next set of pens I'm going to test on each of these journals is a collection of ballpoint pens and basic gel pens, so I'll get started on those. Okay, so once again I'm looking at the pages that I've written on, and they all look relatively similar. The only pen that didn't really respond to the paper very well was the Pilot Friction pen. some of the ink it just doesn't look like it's laid on the page in a way that will stay. Other than that, the rest of the pens all look as if they are doing well. So let's flip the pages and see what it looks like. So once again, we have some bleed through in the Moleskine, an awful lot of ghosting. In fact, with these ballpoint pens, because they have a harder tip to them, you can see the indentation that the pen has left. Also present on the Bondibook, I can see a little bit of bleed through. Less so on the Leuchtturm. This one is looking better, although there's a little bit of bleed through with the Inkjoy that I have here. This is a very popular pen for bullet journaling. The Lemome, again, looks great. Rhodia looks pretty good, and actually this Dingbat one also looks quite good. So far, these three seem to be doing well. The Leuchtturm isn't doing quite as well on the ballpoint and gel pen test. So, time to test the next set of pens. I saved my Tombow Mono Twin for last. I love this pen because it is not water soluble, so I like to use it in combination with watercolors and other pens that are water soluble, because this ink stays where it is. The only issue that I find is that it does tend to bleed through a lot, so the use of this pen on these journals should tell us an awful lot. Once again, I'm looking at the page where the writing is, and everything looks pretty much exactly the same. No feathering on this side, so let's look on the other side. All right, as predicted, the Mono Twin has bled through significantly on the Moleskine, a little bit on the Bondibook. Actually, interestingly enough, it did not bleed through on the Leuchtturm, but it did on the Lemome. The Lemome we've been liking so far. However, didn't respond quite as well to this Mono Twin. Let's look at Rhodia. Bled through the Rhodia. Bled through a little bit on the Dingbat one. So I find it interesting that it did not bleed through. The only one it didn't bleed through was the Leuchtturm. I'm going to do a little bit of an experiment here and write a little bit more and just see if that makes a difference. All right, let's take a look. Keep in mind, this is a pen that does tend to bleed through a lot of papers, so I'm not surprised at the results so far. You know, it bled through a little bit, but even still, it's not significant, especially considering that it did not stand up to the paper. Did okay on the Dingbat. However, yeah, didn't do so well on the rest of them. So the moral of the story might just be that the Mono Twin pen is not a great pen to use for bullet journaling. We have a lot of other choices. The next set of pens that I'm using are what I might call small brush pens. Things like the Tombow Fudenosuke, things like the Pentel, sometimes called a Food Touch, sometimes called a flexible tip sign pen, and one of my favorites because it has a variable width of line as you draw, but it's still fairly delicate. That's the Koiro pen by Kuretake Zig. So let's see how these react to the paper. First glance, I'm looking for feathering, and once again, they look somewhat similar. I see a little bit of feathering in the Moleskine notebook. I don't see much on the other ones. And the feathering that I see in the Moleskine is mostly with the juicier pens. Flipping the pages, little bit of ghosting, but no bleeding on the Moleskine. Little bit of bleeding in the Bondibook. Little bit of ghosting, but no bleeding in the Leuchtturm. Very little ghosting and no bleeding in the Lemome. Very little ghosting and no bleeding in the Rhodia. And very little ghosting and no bleeding in the Dingbats. So in general, this seems to respond well to the small brush pens. Let's try some pens with larger brushes. Okay, so you can see here I have a pretty big pile of large brush pens. I better get started. I'm about halfway through my brush markers and I've run out of room on these pages, so let's take a preliminary look. The color seems to show up best on the Leuchtturm, on the Rhodia. It does pretty well on the Lemome, and it actually does quite well on the Dingbats. Does not look good at all on the Moleskine. The colors fade and they don't keep their same vibrance. It looks okay on the Bondibook. Let's turn the pages. Ooh, lots of bleed through on the Moleskines, predictably. Some bleed through on the Bondibook. A little bit of bleed through also on the Leuchtturm. Keep in mind, these are very juicy markers, so some of this is to be expected. Almost no bleed through on the Lemome. I have to say the two of them actually that tended to bleed through a little bit more. One was the Koi coloring brush pen, and the other was the Art Line Sticks marker. These are really fun. They look like Legos. You can play with them and build stuff with them. Yes, there was a little bit of bleed through, so I wouldn't use the Koi coloring brush pens or the Art Line pens on the Lemome, but the rest so far seem to be doing well. Same answer for Rhodia. Same markers cause the problem, and the same answer for the Dingbats. So in general, especially the Art Line, not a great marker for bullet journaling. Let's try the rest of them. The pen I just used was a regular Sharpie brush pen. I'm also going to use a Sharpie stained marker. The stained is technically a fabric marker, but a lot of hand lettering people like to use these on paper as well if you have a good paper, because it makes a beautiful, vibrant color. Made it through all of those. Okay, first glance, it appears that the Moleskine paper is having trouble even absorbing some of the ink so that it'll dry. I have a feeling if I did a smear test on that, we'd get smearing all over the place. It looks like the Leuchtturm is the same, actually, having trouble just absorbing the ink. The rest of them look pretty good. I'm not seeing a whole lot in the way of feathering, so that is great. Let's look at the opposite side. Ooh, lots of bleeding on the Sharpie brush pen. That is to be expected on the Moleskine. Still lots of bleeding on the Bondibook and a little bit onto the following page. A little bit of bleeding with the Leuchtturm, not as much as I would have expected. There's a significant bleeding with the Sharpie on the Lemome, and actually a little bit with the Ecoline brush pen as well. This is a very juicy pen, so I'm not surprised. It's not really made for bullet journaling, but I thought, hey, why not give it a try? Let's take a look. Bleeding with the Sharpie on the Rhodia, bleeding with the Sharpie on the Dingbats. So the moral of the story is, if you have pretty much any kind of Sharpie marker, but especially these Sharpie brush pens, don't use them in the journals. They don't work. All right, the next set will be much shorter. I have a couple of highlighters that I'm going to try out. kinds of highlighters with me today. I'll be honest, I don't use highlighters a whole lot. Maybe a little bit in my Bible journaling, but other than that, it's not something I do a lot with. I brought a Sharpie liquid highlighter. This is a very typical highlighter, gives you a very bright neon pink look. And I brought with me some zebra mild liners. These are really nice. They give you a nice gentle look, but still act as highlighters, just far less offensive inks. So I'll try both of these and see what we get. So far, everything looks pretty much the same from one page to the next. Once again, the brightness of the color does not quite hold on the Moleskine. When it comes to a neon colored Sharpie, that might not be such a bad thing. However, they look like they've responded to the page all similarly. When I turn the page, a little bit of bleed through on the Bondibook, a little bit of bleed through on the Moleskine. Not much, actually no bleed through, a little bit of ghosting on the Leuchtturm. Almost no ghosting and absolutely no bleed through on the Bondibook. Rhodia has very, very little ghosting and no bleed through, and almost no ghosting and zero bleed through on the Dingbats. Okay, I have one more category of pens. I saved this one for last. These are fountain pens. I only have a few. I'll be honest, I am not an expert on fountain pens. I am a beginner, but I figured it was a good thing to try. So I have some inexpensive fountain pens with me today. Let's see how they do. Types of fountain pens here with me today. I was going to have a fourth. I brought a Pilot Metropolitan and just realized a moment ago that it is sadly out of ink, so we will have to use our imaginations on that one, and I'll try the other three. I'm smiling because this is the test that has shown the most difference from one paper to the next. So this is a really important one depending on what kinds of pens you intend to use for your bullet journals. As I look first at the Moleskine, there is a significant amount of feathering on the Apache Sunset ink, the Noodler's ink with my Ahab fountain pen here. The Pilot Varsity fountain pen and the Platinum Preppy fountain pen all look pretty much the same, but using an ink and using this Ahab fountain pen, there's a huge difference. So first of all, there is some bleeding, or pardon me, some feathering in the Moleskine, and definitely bleed through and to the next page. So this would not be a good choice for that. As I look at the Bondibook, it has the worst feathering of all of them. Really bad. I'll give you a close-up look at that. Definitely bleeds through to the next couple of pages. As I look at the Leuchtturm, it actually has almost no feathering. It's pretty good, although the ink still appears to be a bit wet. So if you're planning on using fountain pens on a Leuchtturm, you'll want to be aware of the smear test and give it some time. On the Lemome, which I have liked for most of the pens I've used today, the ink just does not have the same vibrance. One of the features of the Apache Sunset ink is that depending on the pressure on a flexible nib, it can give you a more vibrant color, a more vibrant red, or a more pale orange. And everything ends up looking pretty much the same with the Lemome. So again, this would not be a good choice. It does bleed through a little bit to the next page. There is a little bit of bleed through on the Leuchtturm as well. As I look at the Rhodia, very little feathering and a little bit of bleeding. And as I look at the Dingbat, wow, this one definitely looks the best. very little feathering, great vibrance of colors, and so far I see no bleed through. So if you're planning on using fountain pens, and particularly some finer inks, some juicier inks, I think the Dingbat is the way to go. So here's my question. When we're looking at papers, we see specifics like GSM, which stands for grams per square meter. We see different things on the package, which might tell us the thickness of the paper, but it doesn't necessarily tell us about feathering, or it doesn't necessarily even give us an idea of bleed through. This is something that we need to learn more about. So in order to learn more about that, I'm going to take you to one of my favorite art supply stores. It's a locally owned store here in the town where I live, and we're going to meet a friend of mine and ask him some questions about paper. Hey Brian, how are you doing?
Good, Jocelyn. Yourself?
Doing great. Nice to see you today.
Nice to see you.
I was wondering if you could answer a couple of questions for me about paper.
Sure.
Great.
Sure.
So first of all, can you explain GSM?
That's grams, the weight of the paper. Mm-hmm. They get the full-size sheet and weigh a bundle of it, usually 500 or 1,000 sheets, and that gives them the weight
Great.
of what the sheets are, and then they cut it down to whatever size they want.
Great. How much does GSM have an effect on bleed through of inks?
It's not so much the weight of the paper, though that does have some effect on it. It's how pressed the paper is.
Okay.
Like a drawing paper as opposed to a Bristol board that's more like a poster board, something a little more solid that's going to help keep the bleeding down. Where a softer paper might have more feathering in it.
Okay. Explain feathering to me. Is this something that you can determine by looking at the specs on the package of paper, or is this more of a trial and error thing to see how the paper responds?
It's kind of trial and error. You can feel by the weight of the paper how much the ink is going to soak through. Ink, watercolor, or marker will soak through. The thicker the paper feels, the less it's going to soak through, especially when you're going with a marker or a pen. It's when you get into a water, like a watercolor or a wash on it, that water's going to get in and do what it does regardless of the weight of it, really.
Okay. So for a person who's just starting out, let's say doing some calligraphy or some lettering with different pens, different inks, where's a good place to start as far as the right kinds of paper to look for?
You can use some pretty light paper on that. Some of the tracing paper, if you want something a little more translucent, is fine for that. That holds ink really well. Even some of the sketch papers are fine with that. You can get something with a smooth surface to it that lets the ink kind of glide over. It doesn't let it sit in a spot too long to let it soak in. And then there's some rice papers that feel like they would really absorb and the ink would spread on it, but that kind of holds the ink in, and you can use that more for a traditional Chinese calligraphy where you have the brush and ink and go on there. It doesn't really spread out too much on it. It keeps the line pretty well.
Great. Great. Thanks. Okay, so here's my most specific question for you today. I did some pen and paper tests today with various types of pens, and this is where I noticed the biggest difference. Right down here we see on the Apache Sunset ink lots of feathering, and you'll see bleed through, whereas over here it maintained its original color and vibrancy, and there's no bleed through here. So what makes the difference between these two?
Well, biggest difference between the papers, this has a little bit more substance to it. It's a little thicker than what this is, and that's going to contribute a lot to it.
So GSM would be the biggest contributing factor there. Okay.
Yeah, it just doesn't have the tight paper weave that does, so it's going to let the ink kind of go into the spaces in between the fibers of the paper.
Got it.
This is a little tighter, so it's going to stay on there a little bit nicer.
Great.
It feels like the same surface, but it's just the lighter weight paper that lets the ink go through.
Okay. Well, thanks so much for your help. I really appreciate it.
You're welcome.
Today has been really helpful in educating you on the different types of paper qualities available in various bullet journals and helping you to make the right decision for what pens to use, what journals to use to best meet your needs. If I were to offer my basic conclusions on today's tests, I would say of the 3 brands that I was familiar with before doing this video, between the Moleskine, the Leuchtturm, and the Rhodia probably performed the best, which is not a surprise. It was the thickest paper. And the Moleskine, well, let's just say that the Moleskine's probably best for pencil. It's not great with a lot of the inks, and it was the most likely to bleed through. Again, not a surprise, it had the thinnest paper. With the 3 brands that were new to me, the Bondibook, the Lemome, and the Dingbats, the Bondibook certainly paled in comparison to the other 2. I'll have to be creative with how I decide to use that particular book. However, both Dingbats' book and the Lemome had a lot of great qualities. Some worked better with some pens, others worked better with others, but I would say they're both very high quality journals. I hope this has been helpful for you, and I look forward to reading your comments.